Before we begin, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are not just stories, they are lived experiences of silence, pain, and truth finally breaking free. And I'd love for you to share in the comments where you're watching from, your city or country, and what time it is right now where you are. Because somehow knowing we are connected across the world makes these stories feel less alone. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and what happened on this Christmas night didn't just break a family dinner, it shattered everything I thought I knew about belonging. It all started at my parents' house in Connecticut, where the snow outside looked soft and peaceful, but inside, the air felt sharp enough to cut through anything warm. I remember standing in the dining room with my 7-year-old son Lucas holding my hand, his little fingers wrapped so tightly around mine that I could feel his fear before I even understood mine. The table was full, my parents, Robert and Diane Carter, sitting at the center like nothing could ever disturb their perfect holiday world, my relatives laughing softly, wine glasses clinking, the smell of roasted turkey filling the air like a performance designed to look normal. And then my father stood up. He didn't shout at first. He didn't need to. He just looked at me and Lucas like we were something that didn't belong in the frame anymore and said, "Leave, and never return." The room didn't gasp. It didn't move. It just paused, like everyone had silently agreed that what he said was acceptable. I blinked slowly, waiting for anyone to question it, to say it was too harsh, too sudden, too cruel in front of a child. But no one did. Instead, my mother took a sip of her wine like she was watching a conversation she had already approved of. Lucas looked up at me, his voice shaking as he asked, "Mom, are we bad people?" That question hit harder than anything my father could have said. I knelt down beside him, brushing his hair back, forcing my voice to stay steady even though my chest felt like it was collapsing inward. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "We are not bad people." My father's voice cut through the moment again, colder this time. "This isn't a discussion, Emily. Take your son and go." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for Lucas's jacket, not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment. This wasn't about right or wrong to them. This was about control. My aunt tried to look away. My cousins stared at the table. No one met my eyes. Not even my husband's family. Not even the people who had watched me grow up. I stood slowly, feeling every eye avoid me, as if looking directly at me might make them responsible. Lucas clung to my hand like the world itself had tilted off balance. As we walked toward the hallway, I heard my mother's voice behind me, calm, almost satisfied. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people need to understand where they stand." And just like that, I realized I wasn't being asked to leave a dinner. I was being erased from a family. But what none of them saw, what none of them ever bothered to ask about, was that I hadn't always been someone they could discard so easily. And as I stepped closer to the front door, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like a door locking somewhere they could no longer open. And that was when I remembered something from my past that no one at that table knew existed, something they would never expect, something that would change everything they thought they understood about me. I did not move right away. Even standing in that hallway with my son's hand locked in mine, I could feel the weight of that house behind me, like it was pressing its decision into my back, not just asking me to leave, but rewriting my entire history in real time. And as I took one step toward the front door, something strange happened. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet pull backward in my memory, like my body remembered something my family had spent years trying to make me forget. Because this was not the first time I had been treated like I did not belong, it was just the first time it had happened in front of my child. I grew up in that same house in Connecticut, the same polished floors, the same perfect dining table, the same voice of my father, Robert Carter, that always sounded like final judgment. I was not the only child, but I might as well have been the only invisible one. My younger brother Daniel got birthday parties that filled the yard with balloons and laughter, while mine were quiet family dinners that ended before dessert because my father had work calls that were always more important than candles on my cake. I still remember one year when I was 10, sitting at the edge of the kitchen counter watching my mother place a chocolate cake in front of Daniel, candles already lit, while mine sat untouched in the fridge. "Mom, mine is melting," I said softly, pointing toward the refrigerator door. She did not even turn fully toward me. "Emily, don't be difficult. Your father is busy tonight. That sentence followed me for years. Don't be difficult. It meant do not ask for attention, do not ask for fairness, do not ask for space in a room already assigned to someone else. My father had a way of measuring people without ever saying it directly. At dinner, he would ask Daniel about school, sports, future plans while I sat silently, my fork moving through food I did not taste. One night I remember clearly, I tried to speak. Dad, I got an A on my science project. He didn't even look up from his plate. That is expected, he said flatly. Then he turned to Daniel and asked about his baseball practice. My mother, Diane, was no different, just quieter in her control. She would adjust Daniel's jacket before school, smooth out his collar, kiss his forehead, while handing me my backpack from across the hallway like I was already late for something I had not chosen. You are very independent, Emily, she would say with a small smile that never reached her eyes. I used to think independence meant strength. Later I realized it often meant being left alone. At family gatherings, I learned the rules without being told. Sit where you are placed, speak only when spoken to, smile when appropriate. Once, when I was 16, I wore a simple blue dress to a holiday dinner, and my aunt leaned over and whispered, "You always try so hard to stand out." I remember looking down at my dress, confused, because I wasn't trying to stand out. I was just trying to be seen. Even my achievements were treated like background noise. When I got accepted into college, my father nodded once and said, "Good, keep it practical." When Daniel got into his first sports program, there was a celebration dinner at a restaurant downtown. I still remember sitting there, watching strangers toast my brother, while my own accomplishment sat unopened in a drawer at home. And somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting to be chosen in rooms where choices were made. That is how I learned silence, not as weakness, but as survival. So when I met Lucas's father years later, I thought I had built a different life, one where I would not be measured, one where I would not be dismissed. But now, standing in that hallway again, holding my son's hand, hearing the echo of my father's voice still lingering in the air telling me to leave and never return, I realized something I had spent my entire life avoiding. I had never actually left that house emotionally. I had only learned how to live inside its rules from a distance. And as Lucas looked up at me with tired eyes and asked, "Mom, why don't they want us here anymore?" I felt something inside me shift, not breaking, not collapsing, but quietly changing shape, like a door that had been closed my entire life was finally starting to unlock. And I did not yet know what was waiting on the other side. The moment I told myself I had to stay calm, I did not yet understand that calm was something I had been practicing my entire life for situations exactly like this. Standing in that hallway, Lucas still holding my hand, I could hear faint laughter from the dining room behind the closed doors, as if Christmas dinner had already returned to normal the second we were removed from it. My father's voice still echoed in my mind, clean and final. Leave and never return, but something inside me was no longer fully inside that house anymore. It was as if part of me had already stepped out long before my body did. Lucas looked up at me again, his small face red from holding back tears, and asked, "Mom, where do people go when their family does not want them?" I paused because the answer should have been simple, but nothing about my life had ever been simple. I knelt down, fixing his coat zipper carefully, my fingers steady even though my thoughts were not. "We go where we are safe," I said softly, "and sometimes safe is not the same place where we came from." That night should have ended in silence, but life rarely respects endings. 2 days later, while Lucas was at school, my phone rang with a number I almost ignored. Unknown. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me answered. "Is this Emily Carter?" a calm voice asked. "Yes. This is Martin Hale from Hale & Associates. We received your profile submission through a private referral network. We would like to discuss a consulting opportunity." I stood still in my kitchen, staring at the sink as water slowly filled a glass I had forgotten I was holding. "I did not submit anything recently," I said carefully. There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "Your name came highly recommended from a legacy financial advisory contact. Your experience in structural family asset oversight is very specific." I should have hung up. Instead, I listened. Within 48 hours, I was sitting in a glass office overlooking downtown Boston, reviewing documents that looked like language I had not spoken in years, but somehow still understood perfectly. Investment structures, trust reallocations, Ownership mapping. My hands moved across the papers slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I was remembering who I used to be before I became someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's invisible guest at every table I ever sat at. "We are restructuring a family portfolio," Martin said across the table, "and we were told you are the only one who understands how these legacy layers were originally built." I looked at him carefully. "Who told you that?" He hesitated just slightly. "Let us just say your work has been quietly known for a long time." Quietly known. Those words stayed with me longer than the meeting itself. That evening, I picked Lucas up from school, and he immediately noticed something different. "Mom, you look like when you used to work on your laptop all night," he said. I smiled without answering. Because he was right. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my old encrypted files for the first time in years. Names I had not seen in a long time reappeared. Structures I had once built carefully, quietly, legally, for families who never even knew my full involvement. And then I saw it. A familiar name. Carter Family Trust. My family. My father's financial structures were more interconnected with my past work than I had ever realized. A message appeared on my screen shortly after. "Emily, we may need to talk before this moves forward." No signature, but I knew exactly what it meant. And for the first time since Christmas night, I understood that what had happened at that dinner was not the beginning of anything. It was only the moment someone finally noticed something that had already been in motion for years. And now, something was coming that even my father would not be able to quietly ignore. For a long time after that message appeared on my screen, I did not move. I just sat in the dark kitchen, the only sound being the soft ticking of the wall clock and Lucas breathing upstairs in his room. "We may need to talk before this moves forward." No name, no explanation, just a sentence that felt like it had been waiting for me longer than I had been ready to receive it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I did not reply, because deep down, I already knew something had started moving without my permission. The next morning, I received another call, this time from a private number I did not recognize. "Emily Carter," a different voice said, more formal, more cautious. "This is Laura Bennett, legal counsel for Carter Family Financial Trust." My stomach tightened slightly at the name. Carter Family Trust, my father's structure, my past, my silence. "We have been informed there may be unauthorized external review activity connected to legacy documentation," she continued. "We need confirmation that you have not accessed internal restructuring files." I stayed quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "I was contacted by a consulting firm. They mentioned my name was referred." There was a pause, longer this time. "That is not possible," she said, almost immediately. "All advisory channels were closed after internal consolidation last year." Something in her tone shifted. Not anger, concern, controlled concern, and that was when I felt it. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Someone had used my name without telling me. That evening, I went to pick Lucas up from school earlier than usual. He was waiting outside the classroom, swinging his backpack, smiling like nothing in the world had changed. "Mom, are we going home?" he asked. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yes, sweetheart." But halfway to the car, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from my mother, Diane Carter. "Emily, your father wants to know why his trust manager is being contacted about you." I stopped walking. Lucas looked up at me, noticing my silence. "Mom?" I knelt down quickly, adjusting his scarf, hiding my expression the best I could. "It is okay," I said softly, "just work stuff." But it was not work stuff. Not anymore. That night, I received something I had not expected, a forwarded email, sent from my father's assistant to multiple family advisors. Subject line, "Urgent Internal Review, Emily Carter Association." My name, in capital letters. Attached were references to past advisory structures I had once helped design years ago, when I was still part of the quiet financial consulting world I had left behind. But now, the document had been twisted, framed as if I had initiated unauthorized access. My breath slowed as I read the description. "Potential breach of confidential family asset structure protocols." I whispered to myself, "This is not what happened." But in financial systems, perception often becomes truth faster than facts can catch up. My phone rang again. My father. I did not want to answer. I did anyway. "Emily," His voice came through, sharp and controlled. "Explain this immediately." I sat still. "I was contacted by a firm," I said. "I did not initiate anything." A short silence. Then his tone hardened. "You always had a tendency to insert yourself where you do not belong." Those words hit differently now. Not because they were new, because they were familiar. "I am not inserting myself anywhere," I said quietly. "I am trying to understand why my name is being used in systems I have not touched in years." He did not respond to that. Instead, he said something that made my grip tighten on the phone. "If this continues, we will have to remove your association entirely." Remove, not clarify, not investigate. Remove. Like I was still something they could quietly erase. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the kitchen counter where Lucas had eaten breakfast that morning. Then another message appeared on my screen. Unknown sender. "They are preparing to isolate your identity from the trust network. You have been positioned as the source of irregular access." My heart dropped slightly, because now it was no longer confusion, it was structure. Someone was building a narrative around me, and I was not the author. I opened my laptop immediately, logging into old archives I had not touched in years. Lines of code, structural financial maps, legacy diagrams. I once helped build carefully for families who trusted systems more than people. And then I saw it. A modification timestamp. Recent. Too recent. My breath slowed as I traced it. Someone had accessed the framework I designed and used it to create a false access trail leading directly to me. I leaned back slowly in my chair, because that meant one thing. This was not misunderstanding. This was design. And as I stared at the screen, watching my own past being rewritten in real time as evidence against me, I realized something far more dangerous than betrayal had already begun. And just as I reached for my phone to call the one person who might understand what this meant, the system logged me out, and a new notification appeared on the screen that made my entire body go still. The moment the system logged me out, it was not loud, not dramatic, just a small red notification on the screen that said "Access denied," and somehow that was more terrifying than anything my father had ever said to me in person. I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, staring at my laptop as if it had become a stranger, my fingers frozen above the trackpad, my mind trying to understand how something I had built, something I had not touched in years, was suddenly being used against me. The next morning began with silence that did not feel natural. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes after something has already started collapsing, and people are pretending it has not. My phone rang at 7:12 a.m. "Unknown number," I answered. "Emily Carter," a man's voice said quickly, professionally tense. "This is David Renshaw from Internal Compliance Review. We need to confirm your recent contact with Carter Family Trust Systems." I closed my eyes briefly. "I have not accessed anything recently," I said. "I was contacted by a consulting firm, that is all." There was a pause, then papers shuffling. "Ma'am," he continued carefully, "your identifier appears in multiple access logs linked to restructuring authorization attempts." My grip tightened around the phone. "That is not possible." "We are simply verifying," he replied, but I could hear it in his voice now. They were not verifying, they were building. After that call, the messages began. First my aunt, then my cousin, then my uncle. Each one colder than the last. "Emily, what did you do with the trust accounts? Your father says you are involved in something serious. Why are lawyers asking about your name?" I opened each message and felt something inside me slowly withdraw. Not panic, not shock, something quieter, distance. By noon, my father called again. I did not want to answer. I did anyway. "You have caused a disruption across 3 advisory branches," he said immediately. No greeting, no question. "Do you understand what you have done?" "I have done nothing," I said firmly. "Someone is using my name." A short silence. Then my mother's voice entered the call. "Emily, please do not make this worse than it already is." I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Worse than what exactly? No answer. Just breathing on the other end. Then my father again. "We are removing your access references. Until this is resolved, you are not to contact any trust personnel." "I have not contacted anyone," I said again, slower this time, but I already knew it did not matter. Truth was no longer the foundation of this conversation. Perception was. That afternoon I received a letter, Physical, delivered, thick envelope, official seal, Carter Family Legal Division. Inside was a formal notice stating that my association with the Family Trust Advisory History was under review for potential unauthorized system correlation activity. I read it twice, slowly. Lucas was sitting on the floor beside me, drawing something with crayons, humming softly to himself, unaware that my hands were shaking slightly as I held paper that was rewriting my identity. "Mom," he said suddenly, looking up, "why are you so quiet today?" I forced a small smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart." But thinking was no longer the right word. That evening, I tried to reach the only person I thought might understand, a number I had not dialed in years. "Martin Hale Consulting Office," a receptionist answered. "I need to speak to Martin Hale," I said quickly. A pause. "He is currently in meetings regarding Carter Family Trust matters." My chest tightened. "Tell him it is Emily Carter." Another pause. Then a softer voice came on the line. "Emily," Martin said finally, "I was hoping you would call." "What is happening?" I asked immediately. "Why is my name being used like this?" He hesitated. "There is an active internal audit triggered by a system flag. Your identifier appears in multiple authentication pathways tied to legacy architecture files." "I did not authorize anything," I said firmly. "I know," he replied quietly, and that was the first time I felt something colder than confusion, because his voice did not question me. It confirmed something larger than me was already in motion. "Then why am I being treated like I did?" I asked. There was a long silence. "Because someone needs a source," he said finally, "and your signature is the cleanest one they can manipulate." After the call ended, I sat in my living room in complete silence. Lucas was asleep upstairs. The house felt too large, too empty, as if sound itself had been removed. My phone lit up again. "Unknown number." I did not answer. A voicemail notification appeared anyway. I played it. My father's voice, controlled. "Final. Emily, until this is resolved, you are not to contact this family or its advisors. Do not make this harder than it already is." The message ended. I replayed it once, then again, and then I realized something that made my stomach tighten slowly. They were not trying to understand what happened. They were preparing to separate me from everything before I could explain anything at all. I looked around the room, at the quiet walls, at the untouched dinner plates from earlier, at the life that suddenly felt like it was standing too far away from me. And for the first time, I understood the shape of isolation not as silence, but as removal. Not being unheard, being unrecognized. And as I sat there, phone still glowing in my hand, I saw another notification appear from an unknown sender that simply read, "You are no longer inside the system." And that was the moment everything around me finally stopped feeling like mine. The words, "You are no longer inside the system," stayed on my screen long after the notification disappeared, like a stain that could not be wiped away. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something deeper than confusion or fear. I felt removed, not ignored, not misunderstood. Removed. The next morning, the house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that does not feel peaceful but empty, as if sound itself had decided not to stay with me anymore. Lucas sat at the kitchen table eating cereal slowly, his small legs swinging under the chair, completely unaware that the world around him was shifting in ways I could no longer explain in simple words. "Mom," he said softly, looking up at me, "are we in trouble?" I froze for a second before answering. "No, sweetheart, we are not in trouble." But even as I said it, I realized I was no longer sure what trouble even meant in this situation. By noon, my phone stopped ringing. Not because everything was resolved, but because something had changed. Calls that used to come from unknown numbers no longer connected. Emails bounced back. Even my access to basic advisory systems I had once used in my professional life returned errors I had never seen before. Access denied. Verified id not recognized. I stared at each message, one after another, until the repetition stopped feeling like information and started feeling like erasure. That afternoon, I tried one last time to reach my father. The call went through immediately. Too quickly. "Emily," his voice said, calm but distant, like he was reading from a prepared script. "This needs to stop." "I'm not doing anything," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. A pause. Then my mother's voice entered again, softer but sharper in meaning. You are putting this family at risk by continuing to engage with outside parties. I let out a slow breath. Outside parties? Mom, I am trying to understand why my name is being attached to something I did not do. Another silence, this one longer. Then my father again, final and controlled. Until this is resolved, you are no longer to be contacted as part of this family structure. The word structure hit differently than everything else. It was not emotional. It was administrative. I was not being argued with. I was being classified. The call ended. No goodbye. That evening, I drove to a small park near my home with Lucas. The air was cold, and he ran ahead slightly, kicking at patches of frozen grass, his breath forming small clouds in front of him. I sat on a bench watching him, trying to hold on to the simplicity of that moment, because everything else felt like it was slipping away. My phone buzzed once more. I almost did not look. A message from Martin Hale. They have formally initiated a separation protocol within the Trust Advisory Network. Your access history is being flagged as inactive pending full removal review. I read it twice before lowering the phone. Lucas came back and sat beside me, leaning his head against my arm. Mom, why does everything feel different? He asked quietly. I looked down at him, my throat tightening slightly, but I forced my voice to stay calm. Sometimes things change before we understand why, I said. He nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to him in a way it no longer made sense to me. That night, after Lucas fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off. No emails, no calls, no messages. Just silence, so complete it felt intentional. I thought about my father's voice, about my mother's carefully chosen words, about the way a name could be slowly removed from systems, conversations, and memory until it no longer carried weight in any room it entered. And then I realized something that settled deep in my chest, not as panic, but as clarity. I was not being pushed away. I was being overwritten. My identity, my history, my connections, all of it, was being quietly replaced with something I no longer recognized. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the cold night air, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was inside anything familiar. I felt like I was standing just outside a system that had already decided I no longer existed within it. And as I stood there, watching the empty street, a new message appeared on my phone from an unknown sender. This time, there were no words, only a single file attachment labeled Origin Records. And that was when I understood this was no longer about removal. It was about what came before I was ever erased. The file labeled Origin Records sat on my phone for almost an hour before I had the courage to open it, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because something in me already understood that once I looked, there would be no way to return to the version of my life where I could pretend ignorance. Lucas was asleep in the next room, the soft sound of his breathing carrying through the thin wall, grounding me in something real, while everything else felt like it was dissolving. I finally pressed open. The screen lit up with structured documents, financial layers, and archived advisory records, all formatted in a way that made my chest tighten immediately. At the top of the first page was my name, not as Emily Carter, the daughter, not as Emily Carter, the dismissed family member, but as Emily Carter, originating architect of legacy, trust structuring protocols. I stared at the words without blinking, because seeing them written so formally made them feel like they belonged to someone else. My hand instinctively moved to cover my mouth as I scrolled further. There were references to projects I had designed years ago, frameworks I had built for families I once advised quietly through third-party channels, systems that were supposed to remain isolated and confidential. And yet here they were, attached to my identity again, but not in a way I recognized. A soft knock on my apartment door interrupted my thoughts. I froze. No one visited me anymore. Not since the family separation notices. I opened it slowly. A woman stood there in a dark coat holding a thin folder. "Emily Carter?" she asked carefully. I nodded. "My name is Rebecca Sloan. I was assigned to oversee transition integrity review for your case." I stepped aside without speaking. She walked in, placing the folder on my table. "You are being reintroduced into a legacy system that has been dormant for years," she said calmly. "Your prior work is being used as reference architecture in an active audit." I looked at her. "I did not authorize anything." She met my eyes briefly. "That is not the question the system is asking. My phone buzzed again. A message from Martin Hale. They are reconstructing your professional origin profile. If you do not respond soon, they will finalize assumptions without your input. I sat down slowly. What does that mean exactly? I asked. Rebecca exhaled gently. It means your past is being used to define your present without your permission. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else she said. After she left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, until Lucas came out in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, why are you awake again?" he asked. I smiled softly and touched his hair. "Just working on something important, sweetheart." But it was not work. It was reconstruction. The next morning, I made a decision I had avoided for years. I opened my old professional network access, the one I had abandoned when I chose silence over visibility. It took several attempts, several failed authentication checks, but eventually, the system recognized me again. Slowly, reluctantly, like memory returning to a place it had tried to forget. Within hours, emails began arriving. "We heard you might be available for consultation. Our board is reviewing legacy structure optimization. Your previous work on multi-layer trust architecture is still industry-leading." One message stood out. "Emily, this is Daniel Whitmore. We have a situation that requires your direct oversight. Urgent. Confidential. Compensation is not an issue." I stared at the name for a long moment before responding, "Send details." Later that day, I met Daniel in a quiet office overlooking the river. He did not ask about my absence. He did not ask about my family. He simply placed a set of documents in front of me and said, "We are trying to stabilize a system that is collapsing because it was built on outdated assumptions. And your framework is the only reason it still exists in any usable form." I scanned the pages slowly. It was mine, not in fragments, in full structure. My design, my logic, my architecture. "Why now?" I asked quietly. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Because someone tried to remove your identity from the system and instead exposed how dependent the system still is on it." I looked down at the documents again, feeling something shift that I had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not revenge, direction. When I returned home that night, Lucas was drawing at the table again. He looked up at me and smiled. "Mom, you look different today." I paused. "Different how?" he thought for a moment. "Like you know where you are going." I sat beside him and kissed his forehead gently. "I think I might," I said softly. And for the first time since Christmas night, I understood that what had been taken from me was not my place in the family, but the belief that I needed their permission to rebuild anything at all. And somewhere ahead, something significant was already beginning to form, waiting for me to step fully back into it. The morning I returned to the professional world I once abandoned, I did not feel like I was stepping back into my old life, but rather stepping into a version of myself that had been waiting quietly in the background for years, unchanged and unforgotten. The office building in downtown Boston was made of glass and steel, reflecting the gray sky and sharp geometric lines. And as I walked through the front entrance, I noticed something I had not expected. No one looked at me like I did not belong. That alone felt unfamiliar. At the reception desk, a woman in a tailored suit stood up immediately. "Good morning, Miss Carter," she said with clear recognition in her voice. I paused for half a second before responding. "Good morning." The title still felt heavy on my name, like something I had not fully carried in a long time. She handed me a visitor badge, but before I could take it, another voice interrupted. "She does not need a visitor badge," a man said from behind me. I turned. Daniel Whitmore stood there holding a tablet, his expression calm but direct. "She is not a visitor," he added. "She is the reason this system is still functional." There was no exaggeration in his tone, only fact. I followed him through the corridor, feeling the subtle shift in how people looked at me as we passed. Not curiosity, not confusion, recognition. The kind that comes when people understand they are walking next to something they cannot replace easily. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was controlled, precise, almost tense in a quiet way. Screens displayed layered financial models, structural maps, and legacy trust frameworks that immediately felt familiar to me, even after years away. Daniel placed a folder in front of me. "We need stabilization within 72 hours, he said. "The system is reacting to conflicting identity sources." I opened the file slowly, Every page reflected fragments of work I had once designed under strict confidentiality agreements, systems meant to remain untouched unless absolutely necessary. "Why is my name still embedded in this level of architecture?" I asked quietly. Daniel did not hesitate. "Because when the original framework was built, your identity was not just an input, it was the foundation." I looked up at him. "That was years ago, and nothing has replaced it," he replied simply. The room fell quiet for a moment as I scanned the data. Then I noticed something else. A live anomaly report flagged in red. Unauthorized override attempts originating from legacy Carter family trust channels. My chest tightened slightly, but not in fear. In understanding. "They are still trying to remove my association," I said. Daniel nodded. "Not remove, reclassify." I closed the folder slowly. "So they are rewriting what I was." "They are trying," he corrected. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Over the next few days, I worked inside systems I had once designed, but never expected to re-enter. Each interaction felt like reconnecting with a language I had not spoken in years, but still understood fluently. My name began appearing again in controlled internal communications, not as an error or flagged identity, but as authorized oversight. One morning, I was handed a temporary access credential card. My name printed clearly above a new designation, Senior Structural Integrity Advisor. I held it for a moment before clipping it to my jacket. It felt simple, but it changed how people in the building moved around me. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Decisions were confirmed only after I reviewed them. At one point, a junior analyst looked at my badge and asked quietly, "You are the one they rebuilt the framework around?" I answered honestly, "I am the one who built it in the first place." Later that day, Daniel walked beside me through the glass corridor overlooking the city. "There is something you should know," he said. I glanced at him. "About the system?" "About how far your influence extends," he replied. I stopped walking slightly. "What do you mean?" He turned toward me. "Multiple institutions are now referencing your original architecture as baseline standard for restructuring protocols. Not just this one." I did not respond immediately, because the weight of that statement was still settling in. For years I had believed I was invisible, replaceable, forgotten. Yet here I was, being referenced in systems I had not touched in a decade. That evening, I left the building and stepped outside into the cold Boston air. My phone buzzed immediately, a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. This is not over." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then slowly locked it. I did not reply. Instead, I looked up at the skyline, thinking about how quietly everything had shifted without me noticing. Lucas would be waiting at home, probably drawing again at the kitchen table, unaware of how different the world was becoming around us. As I started walking toward the subway, I realized something important. I was no longer trying to get back what I lost. I was standing at the edge of something I had already rebuilt, and for the first time since that Christmas night, I understood that the story was no longer about what had been taken from me, but about what was now beginning to respond to my return. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have, as I stood on the cold Boston sidewalk with the city moving around me like nothing in my life had changed, even though everything inside me already had. "We need to talk. This is not over." No name, no context, just pressure in the form of words. I locked my phone slowly and continued walking toward the subway station. But I could feel it now, a tightening in my chest that was no longer confusion, but anticipation. Not fear of what was coming, but awareness that something had already been set in motion long before I was invited back into it. The next morning, I returned to the office earlier than usual. The glass building reflected the pale winter light, and as I stepped inside, I noticed the subtle shift again. Conversations softened, movements slowed. People were watching me differently now, not as an outsider, but as a variable they could not fully calculate. At the elevator, a young analyst hesitated before speaking. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "there is a scheduled internal briefing regarding legacy trust validation today at 10:30 a.m. Your presence has been requested." I nodded once. "I will be there." He looked relieved, like delivering that message had been weighing on him longer than expected. Inside the elevator, I stood alone, watching the numbers climb. 32 floors. 33. Each level felt like moving deeper into something I had not fully agreed to re-enter, but no longer had the option to avoid. At 10:29 a.m., I entered the conference room. The atmosphere was different from before, heavier, not louder, just more controlled. Daniel was already there, standing at the far end of the table, reviewing documents on a digital display. He looked up when I entered. "They are all here," he said simply. I glanced around the room. Senior legal advisors, financial compliance officers, 2 representatives from external audit firms I did not recognize, and at the far end of the table, a sealed folder labeled Carter Family Structural Review, Final Validation Phase. "What is this meeting about?" I asked calmly. No one answered immediately. That silence told me more than words could. Finally, one of the auditors spoke. "We are finalizing identity reconciliation within legacy trust architecture." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "That system has already been reviewed." "Not at this level," he replied. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "There is a conflict between historical authorship records and current system attribution," he said, "and your presence is the only constant across both layers." I looked at him. "So I am not here as a consultant anymore." "No," he said quietly. "You are here as the reference point." The words settled in the room like something irreversible. My phone vibrated once. I ignored it. Then again. I turned it over briefly. Unknown number. Same message as before. "If you proceed, everything will be exposed." I did not respond. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table. "Continue," I said. The lead auditor opened the sealed folder. Inside were printed records, system logs, and identity maps layered across multiple years. I watched as my name appeared across documents I had not seen in years, but more importantly, I saw something else. Alterations. Recent modifications. "These entries," the auditor said, pointing at the screen, "indicate that your historical involvement has been reclassified multiple times within the past week." I leaned forward slightly. "By whom?" Another pause. Then Daniel answered, "That is what we are trying to determine." The room went quiet again. I could feel it now, the weight of something being carefully pulled apart in real time. Not accusations, not assumptions, structure being questioned at its core. "There is one more layer," the auditor said finally. He hesitated before continuing. "A supervisory override was initiated from within your original family trust network." My breath slowed slightly. "Show me." The screen shifted. A timestamp appeared. Recent. Very recent. And beneath it, a signature authorization line that made the entire room feel still. Carter Family Executive Authority, Robert Carter. My father. I stared at it without moving. Not because I was shocked, but because for the first time, the pattern I had been sensing finally had shape. Daniel looked at me carefully. "Emily," he said quietly, "this did not begin with system corruption. It began with internal authorization." I did not respond immediately. My mind was no longer in the room. It was back in that house. The Christmas table, the silence. The way I was told to leave and never return, as if I had already been removed from something before I even walked out the door. The auditor prepared to continue speaking, but stopped when he saw my expression. "We can pause the meeting if you need time," he said. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "Finish it." He nodded and reached for the next file. The screen dimmed slightly as a new set of records loaded. Identity alignment, confirmation protocols, cross-linked authorization chains. And then one final line began to appear at the bottom of the screen. A line that had not fully rendered yet, but was already changing the temperature of the room. I stared at it, my heartbeat steady, my breath controlled, as the system continued to resolve the final layer of data, and just before the full line appeared, before the truth could fully settle into words, everything stopped. The moment the system resumed, the silence in the room was no longer neutral. It was loaded, as if everyone present had just been holding their breath inside a structure that was about to collapse from its own truth. The final line that had been cut off on the screen reappeared slowly, letter by letter, like the system itself hesitating before completing what it had already decided to reveal. And when it fully formed, no one spoke. Not immediately. Not even Daniel. The auditor's hand froze halfway over the keyboard. I stared at the screen, already understanding what it would say before it finished rendering. Primary Origin Authority, Emily Carter. The words sat there in clean corporate formatting, without emotion, without interpretation, just classification. I did not move. I did not react. But I could feel the shift in the room as if oxygen had changed density. The auditor finally cleared his throat. "This confirms original authorship attribution," he said carefully, almost as if he was testing whether the sentence itself was safe to say aloud. My father's name appeared in the next line beneath it, marked not as owner, not as controller, but as secondary administrative access. I heard someone behind me shift in their chair. Another voice, quieter this time, came from the legal representative. "That is not possible under current governance structure," she said. Daniel turned slightly toward her. "It was not under current governance structure when it was created," he replied. I finally looked up from the screen. "So this entire system," I said calmly, "has been running on a framework that is still tied to my original design." No one contradicted me. That silence was enough. My phone, still face down on the table, lit up again. Another message, this time from my mother. I did not open it immediately. I already knew it would not matter. "Emily, what have you done?" The message read when I finally looked. I placed the phone back down. Slowly, Daniel stepped forward slightly. "We need confirmation," he said, his voice more controlled now. "Because if this attribution is validated externally, control rights will automatically adjust across all connected structures." I looked at him. "And if it is validated?" I asked. He hesitated for only a second. "Then authority does not belong where they believed it did." The room felt different after that sentence. Not louder, not chaotic. Just restructured in perception. The lead auditor finally closed the file in front of him. "We will need to notify the Carter Family Trust immediately," he said. I finally spoke again. "You already have." He looked at me. "Excuse me?" I tilted my head slightly. "The system you are reviewing is already mirrored in their internal advisory channels. You have been running parallel confirmations for 48 hours. A pause. Then realization slowly forming across his expression. "You knew this would happen," he said. I did not answer directly. Instead, I said, "I knew the system would eventually tell the truth about itself." Daniel looked at me then, more carefully than before. "Emily," he said quietly, "this changes everything for them." I nodded once. "No," I replied, "it changes everything for what they thought they controlled." As if on cue, his tablet buzzed violently in his hand. Another notification, then another. Then multiple alerts stacking faster than he could silence them. I did not need to see them to understand what was happening. Somewhere, across every connected layer of the trust network, confirmation was propagating, identity alignment resolved, origin authority verified, structural hierarchy updated. I stood up slowly. The chair did not make a sound when I moved it back. "Where are you going?" one of the analysts asked. I looked at him briefly. "Home," I said. But even as I said it, I understood something had already changed. Home was no longer a place where I was invisible. It was now a place where my absence would no longer be unnoticed. That evening, as I left the building, my phone rang again. This time I answered without hesitation. My father's voice came through immediately. Not calm this time, not controlled. "What have you done?" he asked. I stood still outside the glass building, watching people pass by on the street as if nothing in their world had shifted. "I did not do anything," I said quietly. "The system finally finished correcting itself." "You are destroying everything we built," he said sharply. I paused for a moment before replying. "No," I said. "I think you are just realizing what was actually built." There was silence on the line, not anger, not denial, silence that felt heavier than either. "You are not part of this family structure anymore," he said finally. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I answered, "I have not been for a very long time." And then I ended the call. The moment I did, another message appeared on my screen. "Unknown sender. Only one sentence. They are coming to see you." I looked at it for a long moment, then lifted my eyes toward the city lights ahead, knowing that what had just been revealed inside a controlled room was only the beginning of what would now unfold outside of it, in places far less controllable and far more personal. The message, "They are coming to see you," stayed on my screen longer than anything else that day, not because it was unclear, but because it confirmed what I already felt building in the silence after I ended the call with my father. I was no longer being discussed in rooms I was excluded from. I was being moved toward. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. I stood in my apartment for a long time without turning on the lights, listening to the faint sound of the city outside, wondering not what would happen next, but how quickly it would arrive. Lucas was asleep in his room, completely unaware that my past was no longer something behind me, but something actively moving forward. The first knock came at 8:17 p.m., not urgent, not aggressive, controlled. I opened the door slowly. My mother stood there. Diane Carter. Perfect posture, winter coat still buttoned, expression carefully composed, as if she had rehearsed every version of this moment, except the one where I would not immediately step aside. Behind her stood my father, Robert Carter, and for the first time in my life, he was not speaking before entering. He was waiting. That alone changed the temperature of the room. "Emily," my mother said first, her voice softer than usual, "we need to understand what is happening." I did not move aside. I stayed where I was. "You already understand what is happening," I replied calmly. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do not turn this into something it is not," he said. I looked at him. "Then explain it to me," I said quietly, "because from my position, it looks like my name was used as a structural reference without my authorization, and when that was discovered, I was removed from the narrative entirely." My mother exhaled gently. "No one is removing you," she said. "We are trying to contain the misunderstanding." That word, misunderstanding. It almost made me smile, but I did not. "A misunderstanding would imply there was confusion," I said. "This was design." My father stepped slightly forward. "You are speaking about systems you do not control anymore," he said firmly. I nodded slowly. "I never needed to control them," I replied. "I only needed to understand them." That silence that followed was different from all the others. It was not confusion. It was recognition they did not want to acknowledge. From behind me, Lucas appeared quietly in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" he said softly. I turned immediately. "Go back to your room, sweetheart," I said gently. He hesitated, looking at the strangers in the doorway. My mother's expression shifted slightly when she saw him, but she said nothing. Lucas obeyed and disappeared back down the hall. When I turned back, my father's voice had changed, less controlled now. "You are involving external systems that were never meant to be part of this family structure," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "They were always part of it," I replied. "You just never saw the connections clearly." My mother stepped forward again, her voice more careful now. "Emily, whatever has happened, we can resolve it privately. There is no need for escalation." I looked at her for a long moment. "I am not escalating anything," I said. "I am just no longer absorbing it silently." That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. My father looked away briefly, then back at me. "You are making yourself a liability," he said. I nodded once. "No," I replied. "I am making myself visible." Another silence, longer this time. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they were recalculating how to say it. Finally, my mother spoke again. "What do you want from this?" she asked softly. I paused, not because I did not know, but because the answer had changed. "Nothing from you," I said calmly. "That is the point." My father's expression tightened. "That is not how this works," he said. I looked at him directly. "It is now." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything I had said before. For a moment, no one responded. The hallway felt too small for the silence it contained. Then my father spoke again, slower this time. "You are still part of this family," he said, as if trying to reclaim structure through language alone. I shook my head slightly. "I was part of a version of this family that required me to be invisible," I said. "That version does not exist anymore." My mother looked down briefly, then back up. "Emily, please do not close the door completely," she said. I stood still for a moment, feeling something inside me settle into place rather than break apart. "I am not closing anything," I said quietly. "I am just no longer keeping it open at my own expense." Another silence followed, heavier now. Not unresolved, but unfinished. My father finally nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that control was no longer as simple as presence. "We will leave," he said, and for the first time that night, I stepped slightly aside, not as surrender, but as boundary. They walked out without another word. When the door closed, I did not feel relief. I did not feel victory. I felt something more uncertain, space. Lucas appeared again from the hallway, standing quietly. "Are they gone?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He walked over and held my hand again, just like Christmas night, But this time his grip was not fear. It was reassurance. And as I stood there in the dim hallway light, I realized something important had not ended. It had only stopped pretending to be contained. The days after my parents left my apartment did not feel like victory, and they did not feel like loss either. They felt like something quieter, something still forming, like a room finally empty enough for me to hear my own thoughts without interruption. The first few mornings were the hardest, not because anything new was happening, but because nothing was. No unexpected calls, no hidden accusations, no system alerts. Just ordinary silence stretching across my small kitchen while Lucas ate cereal and hummed softly to himself, completely unaware that the world around us had been quietly rewritten. I continued working with Daniel and the advisory team, but now the tone had changed. I was no longer being reviewed or verified. I was being consulted. My input was no longer filtered through layers of approval. It was applied directly into structural corrections across legacy systems I had once designed and almost forgotten I ever touched. One afternoon, Daniel walked into my office and placed a final report on the table. "It is done," he said simply. I looked at him. "What exactly is done?" He paused before answering. "The identity hierarchy has been fully realigned. Your authorship is no longer disputed." I nodded slowly, not because I felt satisfied, but because I finally understood that truth does not always feel like closure. Sometimes it feels like responsibility. That evening, I left work earlier than usual and picked Lucas up from school. He ran toward me like he always did, backpack bouncing, face bright in the fading light. "Mom," he said, "can we get ice cream?" I smiled. "Yes," I said. And we did. Small moments like that began to return more often after that. Not because life became perfect, but because I stopped living inside constant uncertainty. My father never called again. My mother sent one final message weeks later. "We hope you are safe." I read it once and did not reply, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Some conversations no longer required participation. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The city changed its color from cold gray to something softer. I moved into a quieter space, not larger, not smaller, just mine. Lucas adjusted in ways children often do when truth becomes routine instead of disruption. One evening, while we were sitting on the floor building a small model city out of cardboard, he looked at me and asked, "Mom, are we okay now?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "We are becoming okay," I said, and I realized that was the most honest answer I had ever given. I no longer measured my life by who accepted me or who rejected me. I measured it by what remained steady when everything else shifted. My work continued, but I no longer hid from it or from myself. I understood now that being unseen is not the same as being insignificant, and being dismissed is not the same as being defined. There is a difference between being removed from a system and stepping out of one that never truly respected your shape. One night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, I stood by the window holding a small glass of water, looking out at the quiet street below. On my desk behind me sat an old object I had kept without fully knowing why. A simple brass nameplate from my earliest work desk, engraved with my full name, slightly worn at the edges. I picked it up and turned it in my hand slowly. It did not represent power. It did not represent loss. It represented continuity. Not everything that breaks disappears. Some things return in forms we finally recognize, and in that moment, I understood something I had spent years trying to learn through silence, conflict, and distance. Peace is not something given back to you. It is something you choose to stop abandoning. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt erased, misunderstood, or quietly pushed out of places you once called home, I want you to know this gently. You are not what others failed to see in you. You are what remains when their version of you no longer fits the truth of who you are becoming. Trust your inner voice. Protect your boundaries without guilt. And do not confuse being alone with being lost. Sometimes, solitude is simply the space where your real life begins to speak again. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Thank you for listening with your heart, not just your ears. I hope it reminded you that even after silence, even after rejection, even after being told to leave, there is still a version of you that continues forward, whole in ways others never took the time to understand. My name is Emily Carter. I am 34 years old, and the lesson I carry from all of this is simple but unshakable. No one gets to define your value except you. If this story reached something inside you, You are not alone in that feeling. There are more stories waiting here, stories of quiet strength, hidden truth, and unexpected turns that may speak to you in ways you do not expect. You can continue watching, or simply stay here for a moment and breathe. Either way, you are welcome here.